We shall now proceed to chapter 1 of this course, which is all about self from various perspectives. So lesson 1 is entitled The Self from Philosophical Perspective. In this lesson, we are going to understand self based on the different point of view of philosophers. Let us first define philosophy. It is the only science that investigates all things in their ultimate causes, reasons, and principles through reason alone. Okay, so let us have a short background of the origin of philosophy from different groups. From the Hindus, they are interested with the question, who am I? This refers to searching for the deepest self of man, which has a direct connection with the divine. In their philosophy, they emphasize being impartial, objective, or critical. So, sa mga Hindus, speaking of philosophy, you should practice fairness. So, magbigay tayo ng halimbawa. Kung ikaw ay isang judge, before you come up with a decision, the judge should scrutinize every angle of the evidences so that there should be an objective decision, fairness. Okay? Now, how about the Chinese? They are interested with the question, what am I? Which focus on the socio-political moral dimension of the human phenomenon. So, their philosophy came from the two Greek words, ze, which means wisdom, and swe, which means study. Therefore, philosophy is defined as the study of wisdom. Now, the term ze symbolized by human mouth and human hand. Mouth represents the words that we speak, and hand represents our action. This only means that whatever you say, you should act upon it. Practice what you preach. Okay, magbigay tayo ng halimbawa. Halimbawa, meron kayong meeting at ang meeting ninyo ay 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Dapat by 3 o'clock, you should be there. Okay? Because for the Chinese, kung yun yung usapan, okay, human mouth, dapat yun yung gagawin. Okay? Yun yung action. Okay, for the Greek, they are more interested with the question, where am I? And there must be 3 objects of philosophical inquiry, God, man, and the world, because they believe that human being is composed of body and soul. Philosophy came from the two Greek words, philein or philia, which means love or friendship, and sophia, which means wisdom. Therefore, philosophy is defined as the love of wisdom. What is the meaning of this? Love of wisdom for the Greek means good exercise or application of knowledge. So, ibig sabihin, we should not be satisfied with acquiring knowledge. Rather, we should apply what we have learned. So, let's give an example. Suppose a person who graduate in college must apply what he has learned in college, so that there must be application of what has been learned. Okay. Now, for the Old Testament, philosophy focuses more on the meaning, significance of life, or one's existence. Now, for the Islam, philosophy is defined as understanding the spiritual wholeness of the world and humanity. So, in this sense, they give emphasis more on associating philosophy with religious practices or spiritual wholeness. So, let us now proceed with Socrates, who mentioned, "Know thyself." And according to him, the unexamined life is not worth living. So for him, this means bringing our inner self into light. So for Socrates, it is important to have self-knowledge and examine it in order for our life to become worthy of living. Okay, just a short background of Socrates. He laid the foundation for early Western philosophical thoughts and was a foot soldier during the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, and Plato was his most famous student. He died after drinking a glass of hemlock in front of his friend. His father was a stoneman or sculptor, and his mother was a midwife. He used to go to a marketplace called the Agora to discuss things using question and answer method, or the Socratic method. However, he was arrested and condemned for two charges. The first is impiety or disrespect for God, because he was trying because the authority believed that he was trying to discuss things not associated with religious practices. So letter B, corruption of the mind of the young who would flock around him. This is because of the practice of Socratic method. From him came the popular Socratic method. He believed that man is a being who thinks and wills. Now, ano ba ang paniniwala ni Socrates sa self? He puts more regard to the soul rather than the human body. Naniniwala sila na ang tao ay mayroong body and soul. Now, between the two, according to Socrates, self is within the soul rather than the body. Why? Because the soul is properly nurtured by knowledge, wisdom, and virtues. The self, according to Socrates, is immortal soul that in some sense resides in the body and is separated from it at death to be born again. So the true self is not the body but the soul. This is because Socrates said, the body is the slave and the soul is the master. Now, Socrates believed that the goal of life is happiness. How to become happy? A person must have virtue. Now, virtue here refers to the moral qualities that is accepted, and virtue is the supreme good that makes a man happy. So, pag sinabi nating virtue, ito yung application of knowledge in a good way, in a moral way, okay? Because it could be doing good, doing what is right could be a source of happiness and virtue of an individual. There are three doctrines of Socrates. The first one is knowledge as virtue. The second is Socratic irony. And the third one is the art of good living. Let us first discuss the first one. Knowledge is virtue. Someone who puts knowledge to good use is a wise man. So, ito yung sinasabi natin kanina. Acquiring knowledge is not enough. There must be an application, a good application of knowledge. Self-knowledge for Socrates means knowing one's degree of understanding about the world and knowing one's capabilities and potentials. It is only through self-knowledge that one's self emerge. So, kailangan magkaroon tayo ng self-understanding para masabi natin that we exist, nag-e-emerge, because possession of knowledge is virtue. Virtue is the deepest and most propensity of man. Knowing one's virtue is necessary and can be learned. Self-knowledge is the ultimate virtue. And as the ultimate virtue, it will lead to ultimate happiness. Knowledge is the personification of good and ignorance is that of evil. So, ibig sabihin, pag meron tayong binibigyan natin ng importansya ang knowledge, we acquire knowledge, then that represents something good. Pero kapag ignorance, it could represent vice or evil. That's according to Socrates. Now let's proceed to the second one, Socratic irony. What I know is that I do not know. Okay, so irony parang something opposite. Recognition of ignorance is also important because acknowledging that we do not know all represents humility. Humility to acknowledge ignorance before we acquire knowledge. So I have here 2 glasses of water. Glass A contains full amounts of water, while glass B contains half full, half empty. If we are going to represent water to knowledge, what will happen? In glass A, if we are going to put more water, the tendency is to spill out. Why? Kasi puno na. Whereas in glass B, there is still a space to acquire more water. So, how are we going to interpret this? Kapag sa letter A, ito yung mga tao na they don't want to accept new ideas, they don't want to accept new information because they believe that they know all, they know everything. Now, in this sense, it is important to have humility, to acknowledge that we do not know all, so that there is still a space for us to learn more. Okay? So, Socratic or dialectic method is the search for final understanding. So the third one is Socratic method. Ito yung question and answer approach by Socrates. It begins with Socratic irony as if he doesn't know the answer, but that is just his way to make his student analyze things. They're going to define the concept, analyze, and come up with generalization. So according to him, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. The last one is the art of good living. Man's nature is to know about good life. Knowing what is right means doing what is right. So, as simple as exercising good way of living. Magbigay tayo ng example. Halimbawa, class, yung simpleng pagtatapon ng basura sa tamang basurahan. Kung alam mo na yun ang dapat gawin, hindi mo dapat tinatapon yung basura kung saan-saan. Ang tamang lugar ng tawiran, kung saan yung appropriate, dapat yun yung susundin kasi yun yung tamang daanan. Knowing what is right, we should do what is right. Now let's proceed with second philosopher, Plato. The ideal self, the perfect self. Just a short background. He is the founder of Academy in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. And his real name is Aristocles. He was profoundly proud and thankful for being mentored by Socrates, and he was also the teacher of Aristotle. Plato believed that humans could be broken down into 3 parts: the body, the mind, and the soul. The body represents the physical. It wants to experience self-gratification, and it is also concerned with the material world. Now, the body is mortal because when it dies, it is truly dead. The mind, as a second one, is directed toward heavenly realm of ideas and is immortal. Unlike the physical, this one is immortal because when it dies, it returns to the realm of ideas. It is with our minds that we're able to understand the eternal world of the forms, also known as ideas. Now, the third one is the soul, which is the driving force of the body. That is what gives our identity. It inclines toward reason but understands the demands of passion. It is the part that loves honor and victory. Now, among the three, body, mind, and soul, which one represents self? It is the soul, because it is what gives us our identity. In addition to the sense of self, according to Plato, man was all-knowing before he came to be born into this world. This has something to do with the mind. With his separation from the paradise of truth and knowledge and his long exile on earth, he forgot most of the knowledge he had. Okay? In the way we live in this earth, possible that we may forget most of our knowledge. Now, by constant remembering through contemplation or concentration and doing good, it is possible that a person may regain his former perfections. So enduring self is represented by the soul, because even after death, the soul exists. That is what Plato believed. Now let us proceed with the third philosopher, Saint Augustine, who focused also on love and justice. Saint Augustine is also known as Aurelius Augustinus. He was a Latin church father and was one of the most important figures in the development of Christianity, because he was a theologian, not just a philosopher. The City of God on the Trinity was one of his famous works. So just a short background of Saint Augustine. He became a priest and bishop of Hippo, now Northern Africa. He was called Saint Augustine of Hippo, and he was one of the doctors of the church, the most significant Christian thinker, an influential theologian who was influenced by Plato's ideas. He called the man the great mystery. Why? Because according to him, the life of every man is the story of constant struggle and conflict between two forces, that of good and evil. Anong ibig sabihin nito? In every day of our life, palagi tayong nagkakaroon ng conflict. Ano bang gagawin ko? Something good or something evil? In his method of introspection, which means awareness of one's own mental processes, memory is the entity which one can think meaningfully, since human beings have self-consciousness. So he gave emphasis on the introspection. Okay? Meron daw tayong capability to be aware of one's own thinking because of the application of self-consciousness. So the existence of past and future is only possible through memory and expectation. Because of this memory, we are capable to think about the past, and we understand our present, and we could have an expectation of our future. What is self? According to Saint Augustine, he adopted Plato's view that the self is an immaterial but rational soul. So in addition to that, he also believed that the self, represents the inner, immaterial I, had inner self, and self-awareness. Ito yung through the method of introspection. He also introduced the self in the past, present, and future time, which determines the identity of the person through consciousness. So the value of our consciousness in connection to memory, we could think about the past, the present, and the future. But I would like to point out as well that same with Socrates and Plato, he also adopted the view that the self represents the soul. Augustine believed that the humans have the body and soul. So yung soul natin could have the opportunity to see the world through our body, which possess the senses such as imagination, memory, reason, and mind. Since Saint Augustine was a theologian, he also gave value to love and justice as the foundation of the individual self. According to him, the self is known only through knowing God. Ibig sabihin, we can only understand ourselves upon knowing God. Saint Augustine believed that a virtuous life is a dynamism of love, and it is a constant following of and turning towards love, while a wicked life is a constant turning away from love. So we can relate this to our previous words by Augustine, that the life of a human being is a struggle between the conflict of good and evil. So kapag we do good, then it means we are directed towards love, while if the persons do evil things, it means that we are turning away from love. Loving God means loving one's fellow man. This means that we can say that we truly love God if we love our fellow men. It can be shown the way we deal with our fellow men. And loving one's fellow man denotes never doing any harm to another, as golden principles emphasize, which is, do not do unto others what you do not want others do unto you. Now, let us now proceed with the next philosopher, René Descartes. Okay, he was a French philosopher, a mathematician, and a scientist who was considered as the father of modern philosophy. He was the one who has a maxim, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. He was the first thinker to emphasize the use of reason to describe, predict, understand natural phenomena based on natural phenomena and empirical evidence. Now, what is self according to René Descartes? For Descartes, the existence of anything that you register from your senses can be doubted. So the mere fact that it can be doubted, that represents that we are thinking being. Descartes claimed about the self as a thinking thing whose nature is merely thinking, and the self is real, not just an illusion. Self is different from the body because of his notion of dualism. Okay, to explain dualism, it refers to the concept that reality or existence is divided into two parts. This division is between the mind and the physical body. So in other words, the mind is separate from the empirically studied physical attributes of the body. And what are the differences? So here are the distinction between the soul and the body according to René Descartes. The soul also represents the mind. It is the conscious thinking substance that is unaffected by time, while the body is the material substance. The soul is only known to itself, while the body, it can be doubted. The soul is not made up of parts, while the body is made up of physical, quantifiable, and divisible parts. Now, to summarize, human being is composed of body and mind or soul. Now, the next question would be, speaking of self, where can we categorize the self? The body or within the mind or soul? Descartes states that the self is a thinking entity distinct from the body. Therefore, the self is within the mind. Everything starts with a thought. Although the mind and the body are independent from each other and serve their own function, man must use his own mind and thinking abilities in order to investigate, analyze, experiment, and develop himself. He can make use of his mind to find ways of making things possible. Now let's proceed to John Locke, personal identity. A short background: John Locke is a philosopher and a physician, and he is one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers, a philosopher during the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason. He proposed worldview, or the general philosophy or view of life. Worldview is the way people see and understand the world especially regarding issues such as politics, philosophy, and religion. What is self according to John Locke? John Locke's main philosophy about personal identity or the self is founded on the consciousness or memory. Personal identity is a concept about oneself that evolved over the course of an individual's life. So therefore, he refers self to personal identity. It may include aspects of life that man has no control over, such as where he grew up or the color of the skin, as well as the choices he makes, like how he spends his time and what he believes. Personal identity is not in the brain, but in consciousness. Body and the brain may change while consciousness remains the same. That is his point. In addition, according to John Locke, personal identity or the self depends on consciousness, not on substance nor on the soul. And consciousness is the perception of what passes in man's own mind. Identity of humans is based on their consciousness. So he refers self to personal identity, something that we have no control, and this personal identity is not related to brain but in consciousness. Okay, why? Because according to him, the body and the brain may change, but the consciousness remains. So this personal identity is relevant to consciousness. He was also the one who proposed tabula rasa or blank slate, which means that knowledge is derived from experience, which may include memory of the thinking thing. According to him, our mind at birth is like a tabula rasa, a blank slate, in which if we deal with the environment as we grow, that's the time we acquire knowledge through the use of our senses. Everyone started as a blank slate, and the content is provided by one's experience over time. Kaya sinabi niya kanina na nag-e-evolve. Nothing exists in the mind that was not first in the senses. So, hindi siya naniniwala dun sa innate capabilities, because according to him, all skills, knowledge, and behavior are learned through the use of our senses in dealing with the environment. Locke believed that knowledge results from ideas by objects that were experienced. And for humans, he creates this distinction. Speaking of men, he referred to biological makeup. Okay, and speaking of person, he referred that to self, or what our identity consists of. Let us now have David Hume, who says the self is the bundle theory of mind. David Hume is a Scottish philosopher, economist, historian during the Age of Enlightenment. He suggests that if people carefully examine their sense experience through the process of introspection, they will discover that there is no self, or it does not exist. Why did he say so? He stressed that your perceptions are only active as long as you are conscious, as long as you are aware of it. And once your perception is removed, like in the case of being asleep, then you can no longer sense yourself. Then, therefore, you will cease to exist. It's just like a bulb that may be switched on or off. Paano yun? Let's summarize. So, according to him, importante ang role ng consciousness. Okay? Ang self is a bundle of the theory of the mind, and nagiging active lang ito kapag tayo ay conscious or aware of oneself. So, in the case na we are unconscious, like for instance, when we are asleep, we are not aware of what is going on around us. So, therefore, at that particular instance, there is no self because we cannot perceive anything. For David Hume, there is no such thing as personal identity because perceptions and feelings may come and go. Personal identity is a result of imagination. If you can still remember, it was John Locke who explained self, likened self to personal identity. And according to David Hume, that is just a mere imagination. He believed that there is no self as mental entity, for what we call a mind is nothing but a heap collection of different perception. So ang ibig sabihin nito, yung sinasabi niyang mind, it is not as simple as that, because what you may be thinking right now may be different to what you will be thinking tomorrow or the next day. So the perception of one person, the collection of perception of one person, may also be different from the perception of another individual. So there is no really perception of direct identity because it may change. So the self is a bundle of perception of interrelated events or collection of different perception. Thus, there is no stable thing called self, for it is a complex set of successive impression or perception. So hindi daw natin po pwedeng ma-describe ang self ng simple lang, ng ganitong identity lang. Why? Kasi maraming aspeto ang po pwedeng i-describe sa self. So for you, there is no permanent or unchanging self. Okay? Ibig sabihin, hindi permanente ang description kasi from time to time, ang self ay pwedeng magbago. To give an example, Hume compared self to nation, whereby a nation retained its being a nation, not by a single core or identity, but by being composed of different constantly changing elements such as people, systems, culture, and belief. Kung ihahalin tulad natin ang self sa isang nation, siguro po pwede nating sabihin na merong distinct characteristic ang nation na yon, pero para sa kanya, yung description na yon, it could constantly change. Why? Hindi naman po pwedeng maintained lang kung sino yung tao doon. People may grow, people may develop, the nation may develop, the people may come and go, the system may change, the culture may also change as well as their belief. So we really cannot describe the nation by a single description. So in the same manner, the self, according to Hume, is not just one impression, but a mix and a loose cohesion of various personal experiences. We have different experiences. That's why you cannot identify a distinct identity of that person by a single description alone. There is no constant impression that endures throughout your life. And that is according to David Hume. To summarize, what is then the sense of self according to Hume? Well, for him, there is no self. For Hume, man has no clear and intelligible idea of the self. No single impression of the self exists, rather, self is just the thing to which all perception of a man ascribe. Even if there were impression of the self that may constitute identity, it could possibly change. It may vary and always change. A person can never observe oneself without some other perception. Thus, self is just a bundle or collection of different perceptions. Let us now proceed to Immanuel Kant, who says we construct the self. He is a German philosopher and contributed to metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Kant proposed that human mind creates the structure of human experience. According to Kant, there are two components of the self. First, the inner self. The inner self includes rational intellect and psychological states such as our moods, feelings, sensation, pleasure, and pain. The second one is the outer self. It includes senses and the physical world. So, ibig sabihin, yung outer self, ito yung paggamit natin ng mga senses natin para ma-observe natin what is there in the physical world. So it gathers information from the external world through the senses, which the inner self interprets and coherently expresses. So the process involves first, the senses will observe the external world, and then the information will pass through the inner self, and then the inner self shall now interpret and coherently expresses about the information gathered from the external world. So Kant argued that mind is not just a passive receiver of sense experience, but rather actively participates in knowing the object it experiences. So, ibig sabihin, ang mind natin, hindi lang siya absorb ng absorb. It has the capability to articulate, to create new information, ideas from the experiences of the individual or from the object that has been observed from the external world. In addition, Kant also described self as transcendental and it's not within the body. Self is transcendental or independent of experience. It means that the self is related to a spiritual or non-physical realm. So, it exists independently of experience. It has something to do with metaphysics because Immanuel Kant has a background or contribution to metaphysics. He also describes self as not within the body. According to him, it is outside the body. It does not have the qualities of the body. Body's qualities are rooted to the self, but knowledge bridges the self and material things together. Another concept introduced by Immanuel Kant are reason and apperception. Reason is the ability of the mind to regulate those experiences into one experience, which makes the self a product of reason. So if you can still remember our initial discussion of this lesson, we define philosophy and we relate it to the reason alone. Apperception is the mental process by which a person makes sense of an idea by assimilating it to the body of ideas he or she already possess. So, ibig sabihin ng mental process, meron na tayong mga existing idea. Example, idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, and then dumating si idea 4, pwede natin siyang ma-assimilate dun sa nauna nating mga ideas to create or to produce new knowledge. So, he insisted that you perceive the outside world because there is already an idea residing within you. So, kung may mga ideas ka na, possible that it would be easy for you to understand the outside world because you will just assimilate it to your old idea or existing ideas. In relation to this, he proposed two basic types of knowledge. The first one is posteriori and the other one is priori. Posteriori is the knowledge arises from and depends on sense experience. Ito yung mga knowledge na nakukuha natin sa mga experiences natin through the use of our senses. How about priori? Priori refers to the knowledge which arises from the operations of the mind and is dependent. So, possible na hindi natin siya direct na na-experience, but it came out through the personal operations of our mind. Next is Sigmund Freud, who says that the self is the unconscious. He is a philosopher, physiologist, and psychologist, an influential thinker of the 20th century, and one of the important contributions to psychology was psychoanalysis, a practice devised to treat those who are mentally ill through a dialogue. According to Sigmund Freud, our behavior is established by unconscious mind, meaning to say most of our behavior is actually guided by our unconscious mind, something that we are not aware of. And childhood experience affects your relation with other people, the way you behave, the way you react. This is because early life experience is related to present character or personality. Ang ibig sabihin nito, kung ano daw yung na-experience mo nung bata ka, meron siyang kinalaman kung ano yung personality mo at present. People are motivated to seek pleasure and to reduce tension and anxiety which spring from the basic drives. Dahil meron tayong dalawang drives, ito yung sex and aggressive instinct. Another term for this is Eros and Thanatos. Meron daw tayong instinct na ang behavior natin, it's either papunta sa pleasure or papunta sa aggression. At yung aggression na yun, pwedeng papunta sa ibang tao or pwede ring directed toward ourselves. May mga tao na galit sa sarili, pinaparusahan ng sarili, or sinasaktan yung sarili, even mayroong mga temptation for suicide. Yon, aggressive instinct. So, mannerism is manifestation of undesirable experience. Nagkakaroon daw ng mannerism kasi yung tao ay meron siyang feeling uncomfortable na kapag ginagawa niya yung mannerism na sometimes hindi niya napapansin unconsciously, nagkakaroon siya ng feeling of comfort or napapacify siya. He defined dream as wish fulfillment activities. Nag-i-interpret si Freud ng dreams kasi ang sabi niya, yung mga bagay daw na hindi natin makuha in reality, possible daw na mag-manifest through dreams. There are 3 levels of consciousness or mental life. The first one is conscious. It deals with the awareness of present perception. Anything that you are aware of. Let's say you are aware that you are having an online class right now. You are aware that you are aware of your name. You are aware of your address. Anything that you are aware of at the moment, that is within the conscious. But according to Freud, that consciousness is only 10% of the content of your mind. Just 10%. Now, the second one is the preconscious or subconscious. It is related to data that can be readily brought to consciousness. So, this preconscious is located between the conscious and unconscious. These are the information that are readily available when needed. So, madaling ma-perceive yung information kapag nasa subconscious. You may not be fully aware of it at the moment. Kailangan mo pa siyang isipin. Pero kapag naisip mo na siya, madali siyang ma-retrieve. Madali siyang mapunta sa consciousness. Like for instance, yung cellphone number mo, kung hindi mo man siya kabisado, iisipin mo muna. Pero madali mo lang siyang ma-retrieve. Okay? Kasi nandun lang siya sa preconscious or subconscious. And the third one is the unconscious. It refers to data retained but not easily available to the individual's conscious or awareness or scrutiny. Okay, kung babalikan natin, ano ang self according to Sigmund Freud? He referred self more sa unconscious. Why? Kasi itong unconscious, nandito yung pinakamalaking content ng mind natin. So, pinakamaliit, conscious 10%, and then yung preconscious, nasa 15%, and then the rest, nandito na siya sa unconscious. Bakit napakalaking area ang nasa unconscious? Kasi deliberately daw na binabaon natin dito ang mga information, lalo na kapag ito ay anxiety-provoking. According to Freud, men may be aware of overt behavior but remain unconscious of their motive. Why? Because it triggers anxiety. For instance, Alex hates a particular person so much, yet he does not fully understand of the reason for hatred. Why? Because it's within the unconscious. But there are some strategies or therapy which could possibly use to make this information from the unconscious to be brought into consciousness through insight. There are three structures of personality proposed by Freud: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the pleasure principle. This is the first structure to develop. It is the impulsive or the unconscious part of the psyche which responds directly and immediately to the instinct. It operates on the pleasure principle, which is the idea that every wishful impulse should be satisfied immediately, regardless of the consequences. So, tinatawag din siya na child state because of the characteristics of the child being impatient. Siguro magbigay tayo ng example. Halimbawa, ang sabi ng isip natin, gusto ko ng chocolate, nag-crave ako ng chocolate, gusto kong kumain ng chocolate now na. Ayan, so parang decision, ayan, gusto niya talaga now na. Next is the ego or the reality principle. It works out in a realistic way of satisfying the id's demand. Binibigay niya yung demand ni id, kaso nga lang, ina-analyze niya muna. It often compromising or postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. So, ito, tinitignan niya muna yung consequences, kung pwede na bang ibigay or to follow na lang kasi baka makaka-violate against sa societal rule. It considers social realities and norms, etiquette, and rules in deciding how to behave. Sometimes, pinopostpone niya, pero it's because tinitignan niya muna yung consequences. So, let's give an example. Halimbawa, may quiz, and then hindi ka nakapag-review. Ang sasabihin ng id, mag-cheat ka na lang, mas madali yun. Okay, pleasure talagang hinahanap nitong si id, no? Ayaw maghirap mag-review. Pagdating kay ego, sasabihin niya, teka muna, teka, baka mapahamak tayo dyan. So, pwede naman siguro natin gawin yan, pero i-analyze muna natin yung situations. Okay, something like that. So, tinitignan niya muna yung proper timing and if it's appropriate to the society. Adult state, kasi most of the time, analytic siyang mag-isip. And the last one is the superego or the morality principle. This function is to control the id's impulses, especially those which society forbids, such as sex and aggression. So, kung si id, gustong-gusto niya ng mga pleasure, gustong-gusto niya ng aggression, lumabas itong si superego kasi ang role niya is to control yung mga impulses ni id. Kapag Kung ang sasabihin ni ego, teka muna, i-analyze muna natin. Ang sasabihin naman ni super ego, wag mo nang i-analyze, wag na. Okay? Kasi hindi tama mag-cheat. So, it has a function of persuading the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic one and to strive for perfections. Kasi this super ego is also known as our conscience. Ayan. Kaya siya tinatawag na parent state kasi most of the time, ang role niya ay sabihin sa atin kung alin yung tama, kung alin yung mali. So, balikan natin yung example natin kanina. Gustong may quiz, hindi nakapag-aral. Ang sabi ng id, mag-cheat ka na lang. Ang sabi ng super ego, naku, mali yan. Yan ang wag na wag mong gagawin. Ang sabi ng ego, wait a minute. Tignan muna natin yung situation. Baka naman po pwede naman natin gawin, pero mag-ingat-ingat lang tayo. Okay, let's analyze things first. Have you experienced na parang may nag-uusap-usap sa mind mo, especially kapag when you are in a dilemma? So, ito yung mga nag-uusap-usap daw. Sabi ni Freud, si id, si ego, and super ego. Let's have another example. Halimbawa, meron kang exam tomorrow. And sabi ni id, manood tayo ng telenovela. Gustong-gusto ko nang manood ng telenovela, oras na. Anong sasabihin ni super ego? Wag ka nang manood ng telenovela, sayang yung oras mo, gamitin mo na lang yan sa pagre-review para sa makapaghanda ka ng exam mo kinabukasan. Ano naman ang sasabihin ni ego? Wait a minute, tignan muna natin, baka we could possibly make some time management here. Baka naman po pwedeng magkaroon ka ng balance time sa pagre-review, and pag natapos mong mag-review, then that's the time na manood ka ng telenovela. So, si ego, pinagbibigyan niya si id, pero in the appropriate timing kapag nakapag-review na siya. Pero you know what, class? Among the three, sino dapat ang mananalo? It should be the ego kasi yun yung realistic, yun yung analytical mag-isip. But in reality, sino palagi ang nananalo? It's the id. Kasi matapang yung drives ng id. Gusto niya yung palagi siyang immediately na nasasatisfy niya kung ano yung needs niya. There are two substems of superego, the conscience and the ego ideals. The conscience tells us what we should not do. Siya yung nagsasabi sa atin kung ano yung mga bagay na hindi natin dapat gawin kasi it's against the moral standard. Kasi kapag ginawa natin yon, possible that guilt will be developed. The other one, the ego ideals, it tells us what we should do. Siya naman yung nagsasabi sa atin kung ano yung mga bagay na dapat natin gawin kasi kapag nagawa natin, it could be the source of our pride and ideal self-image. Halimbawa, sinasabi niya sa atin na mag-aral kang mabuti para makapagtapos ka ng pag-aaral. At pag nagawa natin yon, it could be the source of our pride. Next is Gilbert Ryle. He has a maxim, I act, therefore I am. He was a British philosopher and professor who wrote The Concept of Mind in 1949. He critiqued the idea that the mind is distinct from the body. He opposed René Descartes that self is a thinking being. He maintained that the mind is not separate from the body. Ryle believed that the concept of a distinct self is not real, that the mind is not the seat of self, as what René Descartes proposed. Sense of self, according to Ryle, is taken from our behaviors and action. Your actions define your own concept of self, which means that you are what you behave. People learn that they have their own minds merely because they behave in a particular way. In addition to his points, he rejected the notion that mental states are separable from physical state. So, hindi siya naniniwala sa dualism na magkahiwalay ang mind at ang physical body. He called the distinction between mind and matter a category mistakes. So, the way he described that, the dualism is a category mistakes. Mind and body relationship are not isolated process. Okay, he pointed out. The self is the combination of the mind and the body. So, therefore, they are actually connected as a whole. His maxim, I act, therefore I am, represents the self is the way people behave. Nakikita natin yung description ng self natin, the way we behave and not merely the way we think. Next philosophers are Paul Churchland and Patricia Churchland. They are philosophers and neuroscientists. They are famous for their studies on neurophilosophy and philosophy of mind. They stand on a materialistic view, or the belief that nothing but matter exists means something can be seen. They introduce eliminative materialism, a radical claim that ordinary common sense and understanding of the mind is deeply wrong and that some or all of the mental states posited by common sense do not actually exist. So if the idea has something to do with common sense or folk psychology in understanding the mind, for them that is a false idea. To claim that this common sense has the capacity to explain our mental states. Mental condition like depression occurred to an individual is technically wrong to say that the person is out of his mind, because brain activity and shape appears to be associated with mood disorder. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, ang concentration nila is the physical brain, which could govern the behavior of the individual. The sense of self originated from the brain itself, and the self is a product of electromagnetic signal produced by the brain. Okay, so neurobiological is the approach. The physical brain gives us the sense of self, and to understand the self, one must study the brain having neurons, not just the mind. So to summarize, what is the point of Churchland in sense of self? For them, the physical brain and not the imaginary mind gives us our sense of self. And for them, the self and the brain are one. But basically, if there is no brain, there would be no self. Syempre, walang magpa-function, walang magko-control to our physical body. The concept means that the self is the brain. Self is nothing else but brain. The self is contained entirely within the physical brain. Because in terms of neurobiological perspective, everything that we do is the product of the processes governed by the brain. My brain and I are inseparable. According to Churchland, I am who I am because my brain is what it is. The last philosopher is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He was a French phenomenological philosopher and author emphasizing the body as the primary site of knowing the world. Ponty's idea of the self is an embodied subjectivity. Subjectivity is the reason and mental perception rather than physical sense and experience that are the basis of knowledge. Ponti also rejected the Cartesian mind and body dualism. He insisted that the mind and body are intrinsically connected, they are not separated. He also emphasized the primacy of the body in an experience. He veered away from the established notion that the seat of consciousness is in the mind. So parang kabaliktaran siya, no? Nung dualism, mind and body are two different entity, pero kay Ponti, they are intrinsically connected. And instead of the mind, which is the seat of the self, according to René Descartes, for Ponti, it is the body. In addition, the body is not the mere house where the mind resides. The body is part of the mind and the mind is part of the body. So ito yung sinasabi ni Ponti na interconnected. They are not separated. The body acts what the mind perceives as a unified one. Ibig sabihin, kung ano yung dinidictate ng mind, yun yung ginagawa ng body. Merong harmony as a unified one. To summarize, self is considered as an embodied subjectivity. All knowledge of ourself and our world is based on our subjective experiences. And the self cannot be truly objectified. So, kanya-kanya kasi tayong perception. It is more on how we view and give perception based on our own subjective experience. The mind is part of the body and the body is part of the mind. They work harmoniously in a unified manner. Thus, the physical body is an important part of the subjective self.